So for the social tools, we will start, sorry, just opening this one. We will start on some more details on the primary production social auditing tools that were introduced in the beginning of today's session by Carole. So we have developed a new ICS auditing tool in regards with the fields, so agricultural context, meaning primary production fields and works. So right now, as you all know, of course, the ICS social and environmental tools were focusing on production and transformation sites. So today we do have this new framework available. And what is very new and of course relevant here for our members is, since we are a multi-sectoral initiative, this tool will apply both to the food sector, so being, for example, fruits and vegetables, coffee, etc., but also to other primary productions such as cotton, hevea, etc. So the new tool is available on the ICS database, and all audit companies authorized by ICS are by default authorized to conduct these primary production audits as well, if mandated, of course, by an ICS member. So in terms of development, we have requested feedback from you, from your audit companies, our main contact points, on the experience you might have already on this field, the methodology, the content, and we also have gathered auditors' capacities in terms of primary production sectors, as we do every year, also for the social and environmental factory audits. So generally, in the framework that looks very much similar to the ICS Social Complete audit that you all know, we have added specificities, and some questions might not always apply to the sites and the farms that will be audited. In that case, an not evaluated answer and rating will appear in order not to downgrade the rating. So as I said, the framework is already available, is free, of course, is let's say available to be used by your audit companies, again, being specifically mandated by an ICS member. The associated handbook for sites and farms and a brief document process is also available. We have started to translate this, and we will continue to do so, of course, as with other tools. So the audit category on the database is well parametered and well defined as being the social primary production. So you will recognize for the scheduling teams and the back office team on the ICS database directly if you're being mandated for a social complete or social small audit in a factory that you all know, or if this is a social primary production, hence including the fields and the farms. In terms of scope for the ICS primary production audit, the scope is quite large in the sense that it covers obviously fields, farms, any land area or premises present on site, but also any production, any transformation, storage area that might exist on site. So it will cover both in that case. Also included and very important in the field of primary production audits, the accommodation. This can be housing, can be a dormitory according to the context. Also, as in the regular factory audits, all eating area and other facilities used for breaks, for example, are also included. A specific point, and we'll come back to this in a few seconds, the transportation vehicles that might be present and that might be organized for farms and site workers are also part of the audit. And again, any other building or premises associated with it. So we have adjusted the social audit, asking, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, if there are additional buildings, if they are accommodation, and depending on these answers, then you will have dependent questions that will open or not in the audit. So you will know if you have to fill them in or not. And again, if not applicable to the current site, because we are very much aware of the fact that we can have very large farms, very well organized structures, let's say industrial sites, but we can also have family farms and very small sites as well. So these differences are incorporated and are taken into consideration with the dependent questions. More specifically on the content, we have added and adjusted some of the requirements. For example, at chapter 0, so the management system chapter, question 0.14 that relates to the employment terms. So basically, let's say to do it very briefly, the contracts, for example, that are signed and that are provided to workers will also include and focus on possible risks of animal diseases transmissible to the humans, so to workers. This might apply according, of course, again, to the sector and to the context of the farm. On chapter 2, the forced labor chapter, we have also added several questions related to forced labor by family members, and this will also be rated as an alert notification, as you know, the highest level of criticality in the ICS frameworks. We have also added a question on forced use of stores and services proposed and operated by the site, by the employer. This will be a critical question, as the other two questions that we added on the excessive cost of their services, because in the first case here of forced use, it means that the workers won't have any choice. And the following one, it means that technically they do have a choice of not using that service, but according to maybe the remote location of the site or the specific context or access to services, it can be a form of forced labor component if their services are not, let's say, mandatory. However, the costs associated to food, transportation, accommodation are actually excessive. And finally, a new open question was added into the forced labor chapter, so not addressing other existing components, because we know and we very much take into consideration the fact that we will face various scenarios and various realities. And this will also be a critical question. Moving to chapter 8, so the chapter on health and safety, we have added a guideline and an interview, a specific guidance point on FPIC, the free, prior and informed consent. So the auditor will be asked to discuss and to interview specifically workers on potential community local conflicts, on tensions that might have arisen from the location, from the development of the site. And we also have a new informative question, so this will not be a rated question, but an informative one added at the top of the audit. Regarding question 8.46 on the site authorization to operate in the specific fields, buildings, plots, etc., comments on the free, prior and informed consent will also be added in the relevant cell of this question. So you have various guidance points on this topic. Moving on to transportation, as I said previously, very important risk as well in the primary production field and domain. So the vehicles that the site might organize, might provide either internally. So when we say internally, it means that drivers, very concretely, are workers depending from the site, or workers recruited and managed directly by the site. And when you see transportation handled externally, it means transportation managed by possibly a third party by a contractor outside of the site, but organized again by the farm. So in any case, this section will be commented and rated. So we have provided question 8.1 asking, as I just explained, if transportation is handled directly by the site or through a contractor, so externally. Question 8.2 is based mainly on interviews, and it relates to the perception of workers about transportation. So it can be about the timing, it can be about the scheduling, the safety, etc. And it will be commented in as much details as possible by the auditor. And finally, the rated question, which is a critical question, 8.3, is about actual sanitary conditions, safety, also vehicle documentation, applicable and compliant with local legal requirements. And this question has to be rated whether it's transportation managed directly or indirectly by the site. So for example, buses, trucks, or any other mode will actually be observed and pictures will be taken as for any other area of the site in this primary production audit. So generally, as Carole said in the general presentation, we have already piloted with several audits the new framework, and the general feedback is positive in the sense that the applicability and the feasibility is confirmed. Of course, we do need many more pilots that will come in the next months, but just a few remarks on the let's say the challenges and the observations that we made so far is that clearly the collaboration with the site management seems to be crucial, and even more than for a factory audit, given that, let's say, fields and farms can be by nature in pretty remote areas, so they can be accessible sometimes only with a vehicle, a motor, jeep, etc. And the knowledge of whether or not there are surfaces, there are plots, there are fields active or inactive, they might be very diverse working shifts on the farm, starting pretty early, but then balanced throughout the day. And also the surfaces that can be absolutely huge, as I said, but also can be very limited in terms of size, provide some challenges that still need to be further discussed. Also, as I mentioned about the access and the remote condition, we have authorized so far to conduct primary production pilot audits in announced mode, announced type. As you know, this is strictly forbidden by default for factory audits, but for primary production audits, we recognize that it can be pretty hard and pretty complex to schedule. Hence, right now, announced audits are allowed, but we will continue to discuss with our members and, of course, with you, with audit companies, whether or not it will be possible, maybe according to the different cases, to move to at least semi-announced, or in certain cases, according to risk analysis, even to an unannounced audits. In terms of auditors' team, we are also thinking about the composition, about the structures of the team, because again, given the accessibility, given the location, the size, the organization of a farm, it could be interesting to be at least 2 auditors at the same time in the farm. So maybe one focusing on the documentation review, one focusing on the observation and on the visits. So of course, these are ongoing thoughts, ongoing discussion that we are openly sharing with you today. Also on the methodology and on the preparation of the audit, we are building a list of questions. So we have also requested feedback from your audit companies, and we thank you, of course, very much for all the details that you have provided us. This list will be complemented over time with more pilots, but we are envisaging to ask, and we do already for the first pilots, ask how many actual farms are in the group. It may also be a cooperative, the exact surface of the total farm area, also the production volume per hectares, for example. Very, very important in the agricultural world, obviously the seasonality. So the commodity harvesting that might vary pretty extensively between a sector and another, and also weather conditions, because there might be some farms or some sites that will be totally inactive if, for example, it's the rainy season, if we have extreme weather conditions on the audit date. So these are all methodological points, but very, very important to have in mind and to consider while moving forward with this audit type. Also, discussion that we are having, and we will be very, very pleased to receive as well your further feedback as we move along with the pilots, is on the duration of the audit. So right now we have not defined a strict table, because again, we understand that we will have to be a bit more flexible, surely, at least in the beginning, because we have various scenarios. However, the factors that we already envisage as being crucial in the primary production sectors is, again, the surface area, number of workers, but also the presence of an accommodation and possibly of other premises. As I said in the very first slides, the scope is global, meaning that it will include both the fields, the plots, but also transformation, production, storage area. So this can vary also pretty significantly. The sampling size will also be defined and discussed more in depth as we move along. So moving on to the other part of this training on the social tools, but here in a transversal way. So the social tools focusing on factory audits, and of course, most of them are totally applicable to any social audit, being social complete audit, or being social small audit, or primary production audit. So here we are referring to question numbers of the current social tools version 2020, April or October, according to the small or the complete, just for your understanding. So as previously mentioned, and as you know, the interview table and sampling size for social audits is listed on the screen, and the let's say the higher threshold of a factory with a very large number of workers, so above 3,200 workers, requires the number of interviews to be at least 1% of the workforce, so to be representative. It means at least 32 interviewees. So on this, of course, we are also keen on receiving feedback and details in the interview template and in the comment sections. On chapter 0, tackling management system and transparency and traceability. So we have talked about the factory profile already. So this is to clarify some of the guidance points. The factory profile is filled in before the audit by the auditee, so by the factory. And question 0.2, that is a not rated question, asks whether or not the information provided in the factory profile actually matches the information that the auditor observes on site. Of course, if the information is coherent, the question will be rated yes, compliant. However, if the information is not, or is not completely the same, is not completely coherent, even for small differences, the not rated questions will be answered no, non-compliant, with a detail, of course, in the comment cell. More specifically about the coherence between the declaration of information in the factory profile and the actual reality of the factory, is on the products and production processes. If the information provided in this section by the factory is not coherent with what is observed by the auditor, critical question 0.23 on the statements on this section will be answered no, non-compliant. A bit more details on this question about the scope of the question on production processes declared by the factory. The scope is actually the audited factory. And by this, we mean not the group the factory might belong to, nor its sister concerns. So in terms of organization and preparation, just a summary of the process. So the factory fills in the factory profile before it was under Excel. As we have just seen this morning, it is now online before the audit. Then the auditor checks during the opening meeting if the factory actually understood the questions correctly. And then by this, we mean that we give a sort of a second chance to the factory to be able to ask questions to the auditor during the opening meeting. The auditor might specify, might explain, for example, that the scope for the production processes is actually the audited factory and not the group it might belong to. So these are sort of, explanations and clarification that can take place during the opening meeting. And as we said, if there are any differences in questions that have to be verified, according to the color legend document that we referred to earlier, if there are differences, the auditor will update the factory profile version 2. Now, about the production process question, if according to the factory profile declaration and the factory confirmation during opening meeting, if the production processes are supposed to be handled on site, so it means that the factory declared that, for example, the washing process is done internally. If it is not supposed to be handled on site and the auditor does not observe this process on site, this is completely logical, then question 0.23 will be compliant. If the, for example, washing process is actually supposed to be done in the audited factory, then you have several options. You have the options where everything is logical again. So the auditors actually witnesses that the washing process and the whole list of processes are actually done on site. So here, on a side note, we do not ask you to be able to assess the exact production volume or the exact production quantity. Here it is really based on the presence or not and the general coherence about production processes that might be missed and that might lead to potential undeclared subcontracting. This is really the risk that we see behind this question. So everything coherent, the auditor will rate the question as compliant, as yes. Now, if it is not totally coherent, so the declaration of production processes does not exactly match the observation on site, but it does not match the observation with the reason that some production processes are not actually used for the ICS member mandating the audit. In this specific case, as underlined in the guideline, the question can be rated partially. However, if the observation and the declaration are not matching and, let's say, the missing production processes are actually used in the orders and in the production for the ICS member requesting the audit, then the question will actually be non-compliant. Okay, on another question of Chapter 0 on Management System, 0.14, so again on the document specifying the employment terms, so let's say the contract, for example, the lead time for the workers to be provided with these employment terms actually depends on the local law. So we will have more questions and more guidance like this throughout the rest of the training. And these are all coming from questions we receive from you, from your audit companies, from members, or from discussions we had internally or during on-site visits or shadow audits. So chapter 1 on the minimum age, child labor and young workers. Here we wanted to clarify the difference between the first two questions of chapter 1. Question 1.1 refers to current child labor. So to the fact that the facility might be working with workers below 15 or the legal working age, so currently. Whereas question 1.2 refers to historic child labor. And what we mean by historic child labor is possibly workers who were recruited below the minimum age at the time where they were hired, but who today are above this minimum age. So you have first question, which is an alert notification, and second question, which is a critical question. More about the second question on a historic child labor. We specifically ask auditors to assess the evidence and the documentation for the latest 36 months. We know it can be hard to find this information. However, if during an interview or throughout your analysis, maybe on another topic, you actually find out a past case preceding 36 months, so before that lead time, of course, the question still needs to be answered non-compliant and be commented. But the requirement in terms of actual assessment is limited to 36. A different question of the same chapter is question 1.3 on non-working children. This refers, as stated in the wording of the question, to children who are present on site in the factory, but who do not work. Otherwise, they will fall in the first two questions, and more specifically in 1.1. So non-working children can be present on site, but they must be located in the appropriate area, of course, the child care room. Hence, if the factory has non-working children on site, 1.3 will be rated no. However, if they are located in the childcare room, dependent question 1.4 will be rated compliant. Hence, there will be no rating impact because the situation is legal and is acceptable. Moving on to chapter 5 on freedom of association and grievance mechanism. So on the grievance mechanism, what we ask auditors is to describe and to assess the process and the effectiveness of this grievance mechanism. Of course, throughout the triangulation process. So through documents, review, through interviews, and through observation. Even for small factories, we require detailed comments and assessments. If a factory has an external third party handling grievance mechanism, this is not sufficient in the sense that it can be commented. Of course, it can be detailed, it can be a first step. However, what we're really looking at is that the factory understands and takes measures and takes responsibility for this grievance mechanism. So outsourcing the mechanism to a third party is not sufficient per se. It can be part of our procedures, but it is not a sufficient element. On question 5.8, regarding the procedures by which the workers can actually freely and confidentially raise grievances, if grievance mechanisms are in place, however, you find out during interviews, for example, that they're actually not working, they are non-effective, or that workers do not feel free to use them, then question 5.8 will actually be rated non-compliant. Now on freedom of association, we have several questions, and these differ in terms of wording and guidance. So first question of the chapter is question 5.1 on the freedom to associate and collectively bargain. This question refers to the factory's practices, so the reality and the implementation in the factory. 5.2 actually refers to the legal context of the country the factory is based in. The wording of the question 5.2 refers to independent trade unions, and according to the geographical location, the region, the country, there can be, let's say, limitations, or they can be structural country dependence between trade unions at factory level and a general governmental based trade union. In this sense, you have a detailed guideline, and if the country has some limitations or has some challenges in terms of independent trade unions, 5.2 will be rated accordingly. And what we will look at in details is question 5.3 on possible alternative measures that the factory might have implemented. If there are no restrictions in the country, this question 5.3 about alternative measures will be rated an A. And if there are restrictions in the country, then the question will be assessed whether factory has implemented other types of measures to raise, for example, to associate or to raise any issue or to collectively bargain. Then the question will be rated according to the practices. So yes for compliant and no for non-compliant. On chapter 6, which is a very detailed chapter as well of the ICS, social audit on working time, working hours, and overtime. We do have several informative questions at the beginning of chapter 6. So these questions have each a different role and a different, of course, objective. So we will specify these. First, before entering into the technicalities of each question, we wanted to remind and of course to clarify, as described in our guidance, as described in our code of conduct, handbook for factories, we are totally aligned with the International Labour Organization, the ILO, that you heard talking this morning in the previous part of the training session. We are aligned on the maximum stipulated in the ILO Convention on Working Hours from 1990, stipulating a maximum of 48 regular working hours per week and possible overtime that should not be worked every week, that should be assessed on average over a certain period of time of 3 weeks. And when you sum up the 48 regular working hours with the possible overtime, you end up to a maximum of 56 hours per week on average. So this is just to give you the context and the reasoning behind the ICS auditing framework rating and guidance. You have the exact reference on the screen. Now, I've mentioned the average wording, which is very important, and it's also included in the audit rating and system. So we understand, of course, that a factory can have peak season, can have a week with more activities, but the importance behind this is that it is actually balanced, not to create too much, of course, risks in terms of safety and health for the workers. So now the scope of the workers that should be taken into account to assess these questions. So when we ask you to declare the maximum number of hours, regular and overtime, we of course refer to the same worker. What we are looking at here is to have the worst case scenario in chapter 6. So the different cells indicate either a maximum or an average. For the one that you see now on the screen, we ask you to calculate the maximum total number of hours worked, so accumulating regular plus overtime, for 3 consecutive weeks. Now, the other cell, called the average number of hours worked over 3 consecutive weeks, is an automatic calculation. So the cell that you have to detail and to fill in is this one, the maximum total number of hours, and the other one, it's actually calculated from the previous one. So according to the maximum over 3 weeks, it is a simple calculation providing the average per week. When a factory does not exceed 56 hours per week, Chapter 6 can be rated up to A, so the highest letter rating. Now, if the factory is between 56 and 72 hours per week on average, Chapter 6 and the general audit rating can be rated up to C, the best. Now, if the factory exceeds or reaches 72 hours per week, so between 72 hours per week and 84 hours per week, whether or not this is an average, so even if it's one time, even if it's once, Chapter 6 and the audit general rating will be rated E, with not necessarily with an alert notification. However, the chapter and the global rating will be downgraded automatically to E. Now, let's say worst case scenario, the maximum number of working hours reaches 84 hours per week. Now, Chapter 6 and the general audit rating are rated E, as for the previous case, but also now with an alert notification sent within 24 hours, as for any other alert, to the ICS member by the audit company. Now, common errors that we can observe in audit reports, and this is why we wanted to provide a reminder on this, is that the question on maximum total number of hours is actually not a sum of the total number of hours. And it's, for example, the worst case scenario for 1 week. Here we really, ask you to provide multiplication. So it can either be multiplication providing first, in the example here, for example, 144 is the multiplication of regular working hours over 3 weeks. So you add them up, it makes, for example, 144, and then you add the overtime working hours for each of the 3 weeks. So it makes it 144. This is the sum of the regular hours over 3 weeks, 3 consecutive weeks, plus 10 overtime hours for the first week, 23 for the second week, and 32 for the third week. This is one way of displaying the information. Another method is to provide the sum of regular plus overtime hours for each of the 3 consecutive weeks. For example, week 1, 56 is the total regular plus overtime. Week 2, 57 is the total again, and week 3, 48 total again. So you have here the flexibility in terms of information display. However, what we really need as details is the 3 weeks, of course, the samplings that were taken into account, the dates, and whatever detail or comments you can add in the relevant cell here. Now, a technical point that can be pretty tricky when entering maximum number of hours, whether these are regular, overtime, maximum over 3 consecutive weeks, please check, if needed, your Microsoft Excel settings, because according to the country and to your computer settings, you can either have number symbols organized around the periods or around commas. So we know this can vary. What is important is just to be aware and to be alerted if you see an error message appearing on the Excel. If you see that the calculation, as I mentioned, on the average number of hours over 3 consecutive weeks works properly, it means that your settings are taken into account. So please be aware of this, of course, when you are an auditor, but also when you are from the reports reviewing team. Now, about the weeks to be taken into account, as I said, we want the worst case scenario again. So if the week with the highest number is week number 3, then I could take into account weeks 2, 3, and 4 to have 3 consecutive weeks. But I also have to check the total sum of these consecutive weeks, because my highest sum might be weeks 1 plus 2 plus 3, or weeks 2, 3, 4, or again, weeks 3, 4, 5. So really need to check again, the worst case scenario. Another guidance point is if there is no national law in the country where you audit for regular hours or for overtime hours. And in this case, we do have a drop-down menu proposing the 2 options. There is no local law or there is a local law, and you need to select the appropriate answer. So in the case there is no local law on regular hours, 6.1, on overtime hours, 6.6, the question will be rated NA, and the drop-down menu option will be there is no local law on regular or overtime hours. This way, the chapter's grading and the general audit rating will not be impacted. Now, another element and component of working time, apart from the maximum number of hours worked, are the consecutive days worked in the factory. So we do have 2 separate questions on consecutive days worked. We have one, which is question 6.12 on the compliance with the local law about the days off, so the consecutive days work. And then we have a critical question regarding the limits set by the ILO convention, asking to have at least 1 day off within a 7-day period. So both questions always need to be assessed. And if the question related to the ILO convention compliance is rated non-compliant, so if there is not 1 day off within 7 days worked, dependent question will open. So you see them at the bottom of the screen, asking what is the maximum number of actual consecutive days worked. These can be 8, but they can also be possibly 20 or 25, and it will be very important for members to have that information. Then the next informative question here is, let's say, the frequency that this might happen in the factory. So how many times has this situation actually occurred in the latest year, in the latest 12-month period? And again, in terms of risk analysis, it is very interesting to understand if there was one peak season, even if non-compliant, of course, but it occurred one in the previous year, or if it is totally frequent and maybe structural as a challenge. On Chapter 7, regarding remuneration and benefits, we do have as informative questions as well the highest hourly rate paid by the facility. So we do have the differences between skilled and unskilled workers. We are looking at the gap between the two, and we ask that information to be declared both in terms of gross salaries, gross remuneration, and net remuneration. So this is a brief reminder. You have that drop-down menu in the audit report. The alert notification, the first alert notification of Chapter 7 is question 7.1, related to the minimum wage guaranteed to all workers in the factory. Here, seniority payment and seniority bonuses or seniority benefits are also included in that question. So if over time, over years of experience, workers' wage is supposed, according to the law, to increase, and it does not increase, it is tackled and addressed in question on minimum wage. So question on alert notification 7.1. Now on social security, another important, of course, risk in terms of workers' rights, question 7.18 assesses whether workers are actually covered by a legal social insurance system. So if the factory actually organizes and makes the payments to whatever the system in place, and the dependent question 7.19 refers to the actual benefit of these workers from the payments. To give you a bit of reasoning behind this is that in some countries, some legislations, they might concern rural or urban areas. It might vary according to the provinces or the states of one single country. There can be difficulties and issues for workers to actually benefit from these payments on social insurances if they move from one state or one province to another, if they go through a public or private system, etc. This is an informative question because, again, it can be related to a specific context, so it is very interesting to have the details. However, the critical question is the one above, so the 7.18, on the fact that workers are covered and that factory actually makes the payments. In case there might be a non-compliance, we ask you to describe the system, how it works, how many workers might not benefit or might not be covered by the system. So you can get this information, of course, through documentation, but also interviews, very importantly. Now on specific workers categories, so piece rate workers, for example, home workers or contractors more generally. We do have the questions that you see on the screen from 7.13 to 7.16 that refers to overtime payment and overtime legal premium payment. So if these categories, for example, contractors, home workers, piece rate workers, are not paid at all for their overtime hours, it is question 7.15 that needs to be rated non-compliant. So regarding the very payment of these overtime hours. However, if these categories are paid for their overtime hours, but not to the correct amount, so not the premium rate, then it is question 7.16 that needs to be rated non-compliant. If there are no contractor, no piece rate, no other categories such as this one, question 7.15 and 7.16 should be compliant and have no impact on the audit rating as stated in the guideline. An example of contractors included in that scope are canteen or security personnel, for example, that might be externalized from the factory to an outside service provider or contractor. Moving on to Chapter 8 on health and safety, we wanted to clarify a few requirements. On fire alarms, we remind you that they are present and they should be present in all parts of the factory. So including production areas, storage areas, administrative buildings, offices, etc., etc. So in absolutely every building and every area of the factory, there should be fire alarms according to the ICS guidance. So again, this is very important because it is an ICS standard and it does not it does not depend on the local law. So alert notification question 8.45 asks whether or not there is a fire alarm present in the facility. If there is a fire alarm in the factory, this question will be rated yes. And the dependent question 8.46 and 8.47 will appear, asking if this fire alarm is actually manual, if it's designated or clearly visible, and if it is unobstructed. In case the fire alarm is present, so 8.45 is rated yes, but the fire alarm is not a manual fire alarm, then question 8.46 and 8.47 directly related to the manual fire alarms will be rated not applicable. On the contrary, of course, if these fire alarms are manual, then the question 8.46 and 8.47 will either be rated compliant or not compliant, according to the situation in the factory. On the contrary, if the factory does not have a fire alarm, an alert notification will be raised, again, independently of the local law. So 8.45 will be rated non-compliant. Then in this case, the dependent question 8.48 will be triggered, and this dependent question addresses other types of alerts, not directly being a compliant fire alarm. So we look here at alternative measures, alternative means. Now, if the factory does not have any alternative mean and does not have any legal requirements to have such, then question 8.48 will be rated not applicable. Now, so a few specific cases, for example, in shared buildings. So the audited factory might be located in such areas with other factories around this. So in that case, if the audited factory, which is the current scope of the audit, has a fire alarm with all the requirements being compliant, question 8.45 will be rated yes, as we have just seen. However, if the fire alarm of the audited factory is not interconnected with possibly other factories present in the shared building, then a specific comment will be added by the auditor, but the question will still be compliant because, again, the scope of the audit is the current factory. So having declared the factory profile, having been identified by the member. But these kind of comments are very, very useful for members to understand also the risk level. So you can put details in the comment cell in these cases. Now, fire alarms, of course, need to be effective. They need to function very well. They need to comply with the guidance, and they need to be triggered without any obstructions or any technical problem. As we have seen in the detailed questions, they can either be automatic fire alarms or manual fire alarms. You have examples on the screen. And on a side note, you also have, as a reminder, we mentioned this in the introduction, you also have fact sheets, thematic fact sheets, elaborated by ICS on our website. So these are publicly available. There are about 30 in the social chapters and the same number in the environmental chapters as well. And these also provide some pictures, some specific guidance on several points and requirements. So a few examples here of non-compliant fire alarms are trumpets, for example, as you see on these two pictures. And another mean of, let's say, of alerts that we can sometimes note in factories is a person shouting or yelling to alert his or her colleagues. These are not acceptable systems, even if, according to the local legislation, it can sometimes be accepted according to the risk level. Within the ICS framework, members have reconfirmed over time that these are not acceptable in the sense that if there is smoke in the factory, if there are workers or there are persons not being aware of the factory premises, not knowing the factory. If, for example, the person in charge of yelling or shouting has a panic attack or is not able because again of smoke or fire to yell, these will not function. This is really the reasoning behind our requirements. So they can either be automated or manual, but they need to comply with all the requirement points. On the manual fire alarm, if it is in compliance with the local law, but it is located in a very remote area of the site, we could imagine, for example, a storage area where not many workers would pass by during the day. So this would be what we call a remote area on site, where there would be a manual fire alarm. Again, if the presence of a manual fire alarm is in this area is compliant with the local law, question 8.45 will be rated yes, it will be compliant. However, if you observe such a situation and you assess that there might actually be a risk, you can and you're invited to comment this in the question and in the audit report, but keeping the compliance, of course, at this question, because it is it meets the ICS requirements and it means the local law. So every risk, every comment, every observation that you might want to add on top of the strict requirements is welcome, because it gives even more audit quality when you're reading a report. Now, again on health and safety, but on the emergency exits. So question 8.31 on emergency exit stairs requires the factory to have at least 2 sets of stairs. Now, a small guidance point here is firstly that this requirement, as all other requirements, includes both the production and the administrative, the office buildings. So we do not make any difference between the two. And secondly, that if the facility is only located on a ground floor, so if there are no upper floors, this question will be rated not applicable. Specifically on the emergency exit path, we do have several guidance points that we wanted also to address today. So question 8.32 relates to emergency exit path markings. You do have on the right-hand side on the screen here, you have a detailed guideline, which is in the ICS audit questionnaire and PDF guideline describing the requirements about the markings. So even if these markings are not a legal obligation or not a legal requirement in the country, they still need to be present on site. It is the same reasoning than the fire alarm, and members have confirmed and reconfirmed over time that this represents a very high risks. Hence, it has to be applied in the same way throughout factories and throughout countries, regardless of the legislation. So we do ask, notably, to have arrows on the ground and the corridors along the emergency exit path, but also signs hanging from the ceiling, and very importantly, striped and yellow painting along both sides of the path and the emergency exit route. And very similarly to the fire alarm reasoning and logic, it is that in case of smoke, for example, in the factory, in case of fire, in case a person is present and does not know the site at all, it might be a visitor, it might be a client, it might be an auditor, then they have to be able to evacuate easily and safely and be guided throughout the factory layout with these paintings, with these let's say lighted arrows, lighted signs all along the path. So very, very important to comply with all the points here. In terms of evacuation passage width, we ask auditors to evaluate this question according to the applicable local law. However, in some countries, there might not be a local law regarding minimum width for these passages. And in this case, if there is no applicable local law, there should be at least 8 centimeters for the passage width. So to sum up, the requirement is based on the local law, but in the absence of local law on this specific minimum width for the passage routes, 80 centimeters has to be taken into account as the minimum width. Very importantly as well, obstructions along the passages and along evacuation routes. So here we have several questions. We have question 8.33, asking whether all emergency exit paths are actually accessible and unobstructed. If they are unobstructed and accessible, of course, question is compliant. But in the case that you see on the screen, if there is an obstruction, this question will be rated non-compliant. And then the dependent question 8.34, which is actually the alert notification, will be triggered if the blockage is permanent. So in the example that you have on the screen, the blockage is actually temporary. Hence, question 8.33, which is critical, remains non-compliant. But the following question, the alert notification, is compliant because the blockage is temporary. On the contrary, if the blockage is actually permanent, both questions will be rated non-compliant. The critical question 8.33 and the dependent alert notification question 8.34. We note that a piece of fabric or, for example, a sheet or a small box that can be easily removed from the passage is considered as a temporary obstruction. However, we have put in the guideline the example of boxes, but very numerous boxes. And in this case, of course, we fall in the category of a permanent obstruction. So we have to keep in mind that all workers and all persons, contractors, anybody present on site during an evacuation has to evacuate, of course, as soon as possible. Then this is why we make the difference in terms of non-compliance between a temporary obstruction, still non-compliant, but that can easily be moved, whether a permanent obstruction, it's an actual blockage to evacuate. Here, another specific case is an emergency exit path going under a shelf. So even if, as you see in the picture, the shelf is high enough for a person to pass under it, it is still a risk and it is still non-compliant because we can imagine an object, we can imagine a box, we can imagine something getting down of the shelf, something falling on the emergency exit route and exit path. So of course this could block firstly the exit route and it could also injure people actually going through this passage. So in this case, it is still non-compliant. On the Health and Safety Committees now, you do have question 8.9 asking whether the factory has a sort of a committee of this sort, so a Health and Safety Committee that is responsible to address, for example, safety of equipment, machinery, of personal protective equipment, etc., etc. If the factory does not have a Health and Safety Committee, but the Health and Safety Committee is not required by the local law, question 8.9 will be rated non-compliant, non-applicable, sorry. This is because 8.9 is related to the local law. So if not present and not required by local law, as in the general guidance of the ICS audit, this question will be rated NA, not applicable. On the dormitories, so you know this is the dependent section of chapter 8 on health and safety, opening only if there is a dormitory and accommodation on site. In the current version, we do have several alert notifications in this section. This was not the case in the previous audit version before 2020. So the current alert notifications of the dormitory sections are the ones that you see on the screen on emergency exits on every floor of the dormitory, on emergency exits on obstructions, as we just seen for the production section, but it applies exactly the same way for the dormitories. The presence of a fire alarm, we have reminded this previously, the fire alarms need to be present in absolutely every area and every building of the factory, hence also including the dormitories. And finally, on fire extinguishers being present on every floor of the dormitory. Now on the scope of the dormitories, they are and they have to be included in the audit if they are present on site. If the dormitory is located outside of the premises, it is not included in the audit scope. Another specific case is if the dormitory is on site, is located within the factory premises, but is managed and it belongs to a sister company. In this case, it still has to be included in the audit scope. So the logic is if the dormitory is within the factory premises, then it is included. If it is outside the factory's premises, it is not included in the audit scope, regardless of whether it is managed by a sister company or not. Now on the PPEs, so the personal protective equipment, regardless of the industry, the activity, the risk level, etc. of the audited factory, we require that all workers at the least wear shoes and clothes to have a minimal protection. Then other personal protective equipment might be, of course, required. They could be gloves, they could be safety glasses, safety shoes, earplugs, etc., etc. And this will depend on the industry risk level, on the legislation, and on specific guidance. But the minimum is for absolutely any production site, transformation, packaging unit that workers at least wear shoes and clothes. About questions on the certificates, for example, on building safety, on fire safety documentation. So this relates to questions 8.1 and 8.2, so the very first questions of chapter 8 on health and safety. We can have the case of facilities having filled in a request to obtain these certificates and these documents, but not having received them yet. In this case, if the factory filled in the request to the local authorities, for example, but did not receive the certificates, the questions are still non-compliant because you cannot actually assess the certificates. However, this detail has to be included in the comment section and in the corrective action plan, because it is still an interesting information for the members to know that the factory actually started the procedure and actually made a formal request to a local authority. But since the certificates are not in the factory's hands and you cannot evaluate and assess them, these questions are still non-compliant. Now, moving on to the last part of this training, so focusing on environmental auditing tools. We have updated about a year ago the audit mandates structure for environmental audits. So you do have the screenshot of the auditor's guideline on the screen. Previously, the criteria that were taken into account were the factory's number of workers, as for the social audits, and the presence of wastewater and its treatment. In the current mandates table, it is the factory size in terms of total surface area in square meters. So you have here the thresholds for small, medium, or large factory related to, again, the surface in square meters. And you add these categories through the second criterion, which is the presence or not and the generation or not of wastewater from production processes. If there is wastewater generated from production processes, then you should look at if there is an on-site effluent treatment plant or not in the factory. If there is an off-site common ETP, so a common effluent treatment plant, or if there is no treatment at all. Then you will have the exact audit duration in terms of man-days that was defined after an in-depth analysis and detailed discussions and conversation in working groups. So this structure is applied now and has been applied now for about a year. In terms of methodology for the environmental audits, we do have the table that you also see on the screen for the interviewees. So unlike for the social audits, there's no strict minimum number of interviews. And the reason behind this is that you can have a person in charge of chemical management, but this person will also be in charge, for example, of wastewater or of waste. So we can have the same key workers and the same key managers handling different topics. And what we really look at here are categories of workers with these responsibilities or with these specific tasks. So for each chapter and each topic, we will ask auditors to interview at least one worker and one manager. So these are all details provided in the guidelines. And another particular attention that we really want to stress is about the chapter on wastewater and effluent. So specific observations should be done and should be noted for the ETP, so the effluent treatment plant operator in charge of possibly, of course, the ETP, but also chemical storage and management. So we really stress that it's more about the job posts, about the responsibilities, the tasks operated by these workers and managers, rather than the exact number of interviews. But we really want to have at least these categories, and of course more if needed. On interviews as well, in terms of confidentiality, we do require auditors to interview workers and appointed managers of these specific topics, of course in a confidential way, but a bit differently than in the social audit. So concretely, when you are observing, you're doing a factory tour, and you are walking throughout the premises, you will interview, for example, those chemical storage worker in charge of storing chemicals, in charge of managing chemicals, doing the inventory, etc. You might interview them directly in the related area. And this will be particularly interesting because you will be able to ask them how do they organize the storage area, where are the security, the safety data sheets located directly in the chemical area and chemical room. So you are allowed to interview also the ETP operator directly in the ETP premises without going specifically to a separate room as we ask for the social audits, because we are, of course, tackling different topics and different requirements here. However, we still require the factory management not to be present during these interviews. So they are still, of course, confidential, but it is just in terms of organization that we allow you and we allow auditors to audit within the premises themselves and not a separate room. In the latest environmental audit template that was released in January 2022, the interview template appears directly in the ICS environmental questionnaire. So you see on the screen that the Excel sheet appears here in an additional tab. And the reason behind this is just to be more visible for auditors. So the interview template is an additional document, but it's totally part of the deliverables after an audit. So it should be detailed and it should still be uploaded as a single document. We have just made it more visible, but it still needs to be generated and uploaded as a single one document. Another sheet of the Excel questionnaire is the document list. This is to stress that we have reduced the number of documents to be checked and to be verified by an environmental auditor during an ICS audit. So you will see, if you haven't audited yet against this new version, that the list is shorter. So this was also the result of an in-depth analysis and discussions in working groups. So we have added several specific alerts in this new audit version, and the same will be done in the next social audit version to be developed, as we said, in the coming months. So we have added, firstly, a specific alert if a pillar of the triangulation is missing. What we call a pillar of triangulation is, for example, an access denied to a part of the factory, to one building, to one room, to a section. So this is for the pillar of the observation. For the pillar of interviews, it can be that the factory management does not authorize the auditor to interview or does not ensure that the interview's conditions are compliant with the ICS guideline. Or thirdly, about documentation review, the factory can deny the access to records and to some documents. So you have several choices in the drop-down menu according to if is one pillar missing, if there are two, if there are three. So you have the different scenarios. If you have a denied access to one of the three, so observation, documentation review, and interviews, you should select the appropriate answer. And when selecting this appropriate answer, the global audit rating will be automatically downgraded to E. So this is just for your information. Of course, we remind that auditors are not to provide an audit rating to the factory during the audit or during the closing meeting. This is done after the audit by the member. But for your information and understanding, this has a strong impact because if one pillar is missing, then the rating will be E independently of the other questions. The second specific alert that was added to the environmental audit version released early this year is the alert in case of a bribery attempt. So if the factory tries to bribe the auditor by any means, the auditor should report immediately this to, of course, the audit company he or she works for. And now through a new template, which is a Word document that you see here at the bottom right of the screen, it is called the bribery attempt notification. And this bribery attempt, so you have the specific question, did the factory attempt to bribe the auditor here? If the answer is yes, this will not appear in the local CAP for your information. It will only appear in the Excel official CAP. And this is also to protect auditors on site. And this is the very first reason why we do not make it visible in the local CAP. So the member will be notified, in the Excel CAP, of course, but most importantly, through an alert sent by the audit company within 24 hours. So this is the same lead time required for alert notifications. So in case of alert notification or bribery attempt, we ask the audit company to report this within 24 hours. The notification template has to be sent as you do for an alert notification. But here, of course, we acknowledge the fact that the investigation will not be finished within 24 hours. So it is the comments, the preliminary observations, any picture, any evidence, any quote that the auditor will be able to report will be included in this bribery attempt notification. And then the entire and the follow-up on the investigation process, the actions taken, etc., will follow and will be communicated as soon as possible and regularly by the audit company to the ICS member having mandated the audit. So at your level, if you are an auditor, if you face a bribery attempt in a factory during an audit, you should report this in the cell at the top of the audit, environmental audit. You should fill in the bribery attempt notification with as much details as possible. Be reassured that it won't appear in the local cap, it will only appear in the Excel cap. And then the audit company, back office and responsible persons will notify within 24 hours by email the ICS member with this bribery attempt notification. And then, of course, more details will follow. On the different requirements of the environmental audit framework, you do have the core requirements. These are, let's say, the list of points, the list of guidances, of questions that are always assessed during an environmental audit, regardless, of course, of the maturity level, regardless of the compliance level of the facility. Then the auditors should have in mind that the advanced requirements, so the questions related more to best practices, related, for example, to the reduction of water consumption, energy consumption that you have at the end of each chapter, will only be assessed if the global rating of the audit is equal or higher than 75% B. More details in terms of rating for specific questions. You do have the two first questions of, let's say, every chapter in the environmental audit framework are structured in the same way. So the first question, here we have the example for chapter 4, for wastewater and effluent treatment. The first question asks whether the factory is required to have permits, licenses, official contracts, certificates, etc., with regards to the relevant chapter. So this question has to be answered and has to be commented if these permits, licenses, etc. apply, then with the exact reference of the relevant certificate or permits. And the second question, which is a dependent question from the first one, will ask if these permits and these licenses are actually valid. So here we do not request you to copy paste exactly the same comment than for the first question, but rather to comment if the validity date is compliant, if it's of course overdue, etc. So first one is about the requirement to have these permits, and the second one is about the compliance in terms of validity date, in terms of content of the factory regarding these permits and certificates. On chapter 1, on the environmental management system, we ask at question 1.5 whether there is a person of the management designated officially to coordinate environmental management activities. This is really the starting point, let's say, of the environmental compliance and activities, is to actually have a team or a person in charge, understanding, coordinating these topics. So we can have the case of an external consultant being appointed by the factory to be in charge of these management activities. And in this case, question 1.5 will be rated partially compliant. And why do we not rate it completely compliant is exactly because we want to ensure that the factory management, internal management, actually takes into consideration, understands, and considers as strictly important the environmental activities. And externalizing this can be one of the solutions, one of the ways to proceed, but will only generate a partial compliance. Then in this case, what is also interesting to evaluate and that we request you to comment is the frequency, the regularity of the presence of this consultant. Is this consultant appointed to come in the factory only once per year or to work remotely on the environmental management activities? Or is this, on the contrary, is this compliant consultant, coming in the factory very often, observing the processes, talking with teams on the ground, etc. So these are interesting comments in terms of risk analysis. Now on chapter 4, so the wastewater and effluent chapter, on the presence of wastewater. So you have an informative question at the beginning of chapter 4 asking if the factory generates wastewater. Here we are looking at industrial wastewater, so coming directly from production processes, for example. If the answer is no, so if the factory is, for instance, a packing unit only and has no wastewater, then this question will be answered no, and automatically related questions and the chapter 4 in general will be not evaluated. So you will see in the summary of content, you will see in the audit report directly that the question moved to not evaluated. Now, if the factory generates wastewater, but does not have an effluent treatment plant, an ETP, on site. Now we want to understand if the factory does not have an ETP, but is not supposed to have an ETP in terms of local law, in terms of processes, activities generated on site, then if no ETP, but not supposed to have an ETP, you will see again that if you select this option in the drop-down menu here, the related question addressing ETP conditions, operations, ETP management system, etc., will automatically move to not evaluated. Now, if the factory has and uses a shared ETP, so a shared effluent treatment plant, this is part of the audit scope. So very importantly and very useful in terms of audit preparation and audit scheduling is that if at the stage of the factory profile completion and audit preparation, so the audit company and or the ICS member understands that the factory uses a shared ETP, it is crucial that the ICS member is informed so that they could communicate with the factory, sharing as well the ETP and primarily with the audited factory, that the shared ETP will be part of the audit scope. So this is again, as for the storage area, the canteen, the accommodation, etc., etc., this is just to help preparing and help ensuring that the factories are aware of the scope. So it is very important to communicate well in advance and for the factory to be prepared, informed, and sensitized to these topics so that they can manage with the sister concerns or the other units. A very detailed point you have on the screen is on wastewater bills that can serve as evidence. So we are here in a situation where the factory meets all of the conditions that you see on your screen. So it meets the condition of being connected to a common ETP, a common effluent treatment plant, of course having a valid agreement, the wastewater being treated by this external ETP, and if the factory also has meters in place to monitor the water use, receives bills from the ETP with the exact amount, and also that you cannot observe any possible discharge in the environment, then in all of these cases, when all conditions are met, if the factory provides wastewater bills, so from the common ETP, based on wastewater discharge, question 4.13 that you have here on the flow meters installed before and after, so at ETP inlet and outlet points, this question can be compliant. Why? Because the wastewater bills based on wastewater discharge will give us information on how the wastewater is actually treated if all other conditions are met. And on the contrary, if wastewater bills are provided as evidence, but that they are based on water use, so let's say at the entry points into the processes, then we cannot ensure that there's no discharge into the environment in between the water use and the ETP. Hence, in this case, the wastewater bills will not be sufficient element to prove the compliance. Hence, question 4.13 will be rated non-compliant. You have all of these details in the guidance. Now, again, on wastewater parameters, previous question from 2020 version 4.12 had several components. So we had the wastewater parameters after treatment. We also had the regularity of the checks and the monitoring, and the knowledge as well from the operator. So we have separated these grouped questions into 3 more detailed questions. So you now have questions 4.9, 4.10, and 4.11, respectively. On 4.9, the procedures actually put in place to monitor, control wastewater parameters, with all of the details in the guidance. The next dependent question, 4.10, relates to the ETP operator knowledge, understanding of these procedures. And the third question, 4.11, looks at the factory internal tests and records regularity. So we have detailed, after discussions in working groups and feedback from you, this question in more specific requirements and questions. On the eye wash and shower station at chapter 7, we have also detailed the guideline. So you can have in some situations an eye wash station or a shower. Regarding if the risk is high in terms of workers being splashed, for example, with a chemical, being hit by chemical vapor, a simple eye wash station might not be sufficient. Then in this case, a shower station should be installed. And in the other case scenario, if an eye wash station remains necessary, is also because the shower pressure might be too high for the eyes. So if the worker is splashed directly in the eyes, he or she still needs to have an eye wash station. So the requirement here is either 1 or the 2 regarding to the risk level, to the requirements, and to the specific observation on site. For your information, we have also deleted some questions, so we have simplified the environmental audit framework because they were both in the environmental audit framework and in the social audit framework. So these questions were mainly at chapter 8, so emergency procedures in the environmental audit questionnaire. So you have 8.9, 8.10 on fire drills conducted on a regular basis, on the documentation of these fire drills, and then the following questions, 8.12, 13, and 14, on the emergency response team and workers, and the health and safety trainings for new or existing workers. These questions are now deleted from the environmental audit questionnaire, but are still present, of course, in the social audit questionnaire. And the logic behind this was not to duplicate questions and requirements. You have seen in the statistics that the volume of environmental audits is growing. So more and more members are launching audit campaigns also with the environmental framework. Some of them are conducting both social and environmental audits at the same time, on following days or on following months. So just to avoid duplication and time spent on these questions, since they are already covered by the social framework, we deleted them from the environmental audit framework. A very important change and update in the new environmental audit framework is the impact of the alert notification rating. So we now have 4 alert notifications, so with the highest level of criticity. First one on the discharge of possible industrial wastewater directly into the environment. Second one is at chapter 5 on emissions to air being above limits according to the local law. Chapter 6 has 2 alert notifications. So chapter 6 is on waste management. The first one is about the storage of hazardous waste and substances. So does the storage have possible contact directly with the environment, so with the rain or with soils, for example? And the last one, still at chapter 6, is about on-site waste burning or uncontrolled landfilling. So the change here is that the number of alert notifications is limited. We only have 4. However, their rating impact is very high. So it is exactly the same logic than for the social audit framework, meaning that if one alert notification is raised, the chapter related to that alert notification, but also the global rating, will be rated E. So automatically, the final rating of the audit will be E regardless of the other chapters and compliances. We remind again, this is for your information, for your understanding, but the final rating is not to be communicated by the auditor to the factory. So we have finished this section. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sure there might be and there have been questions in the chat, so I will leave the floor to my colleagues if needed to complement or to ask any questions already. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cécile, for this very clear presentation. We hope so. We hope that this was clear for you too. We have already received more than 120 questions in the chat. So we have answered all the questions, most of the questions in the chat. We will share with you the summary of these questions and all the answers provided and additional answers to frequently asked questions in a document, so you will be able to retrieve all the answers provided to these documents, and we will provide you with all the resources, materials shared today. So the link to the presentations, but also the link to the video and the recording of the session today. This would be a help for you also to translate, if needed, the materials. So you will be able to get the support to get the the materials to be translated if needed. So everything will be shared in the coming days with all the participants and all the registered participants. So we hope that this was useful for you. And maybe we have finalized the session a little bit earlier than planned, but we will let the chat box open a few additional minutes if you want to share some additional questions. But I'm pretty sure that you have been provided with a lot of useful resources already right now, and we will be happy to continuously discuss with you, with the audit firms, but also involving the ICS members to continuously improve the framework, the ICS framework, and to take also into consideration within the working groups all the feedback we can receive from you that are dealing with some challenges on site, and we are completely aware of it. This is also why we are happy to follow some audits and to complement the collaborations with the audit firms in working groups also involving the ICS member. So thank you for that. Maybe Cecile and Nina, you have something to add?
No, everything is clear. We're very pleased about the high participation. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Cecile. Thank you, Nina. We were really happy to have more than 340 participants connected to this session. So thank you to all of you. Really happy to let the chat box open a few additional minutes, and thank you very much for your collaboration. Thank you. Bye.